So good morning and good afternoon to all of you that have joined us for today's Transatlantic Tuesday. My name is Sudha David-Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion. Transatlantic Tuesdays is a series that's devoted to pertinent issues in the transatlantic relationship. And today we're going to discuss Germany's energy policy reform in light of Chancellor Scholz's Zeitenwende speech, specifically looking at energy dependency in Europe's biggest market. And as always, we're going to start with a moderated conversation for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from all of you. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and they'll automatically queue up so you could start posing your questions right away. We have a terrific panel for today. I'd like to introduce Veronika Grimm, who is a member of the German Council of Economic Experts and a professor of economic theory at Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen, at Erlangen, Nürnberg. Then I also have my great colleague, Jacob Kirkegaard, who's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels office, and he's also a senior non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So let's get right to it. And Veronika, I'm going to start with you. I guess, you know, the Zeitenwende that happened, the speech that was given on February 27th was heralded as a new start for Germany, but the energy track obviously seems to be stalled. Seems very difficult for Germany to unwind its energy dependency from Russia. And the new government is stressing that a halt of fossil fuels from Russia would have catastrophic effects. Whereas the Leopoldina Academy, the National Academy of Sciences, says the impact would be manageable. So where do you think things stand, and what do you think the conundrum is for policymakers here in Berlin?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. I think the situation is a difficult one. Germany is quite dependent on Russian energy imports. Approximately half of the gas is coming from Russia, 35% of the oil, and half of the coal. So there's quite some dependency, and there have now, as you mentioned, quite some studies that analyzed the question whether it would be manageable and what it would mean to become independent and to cut off the Russian supplies. And the studies take various perspectives. So there are studies, for example, by Bruegel, or also the Leopoldina, who analyze the question, how could we manage from an energy provision point of view to get rid of Russian gas, oil and coal. There are studies where such a scenario is analyzed as a scenario in economic forecast models. And those models find a drop of the GDP of 3 plus minus percentage points up to -6. So there would be a significant slowdown of growth of the economy. And then there are trade models that also analyze the scenario that we have to substitute Russian gas and oil and coal, and those also find a drop of the GDP by around 3%. So it would be certainly getting Germany in a recession. So at the moment, the economic forecasts see 2% growth approximately for the German economy for 2022. And if now the energy supplies from Russia would be stopped, this would certainly drive us into a recession at higher price levels. We have a inflation rate of 7% roundabout currently. It is not supposed to decrease in short in the upcoming months. So the forecasted inflation rate is around 6% for this year. And of course, if such a cutoff of Russian energy supplies would come in come on top of that, of course, we would also see higher prices, higher energy prices, and then also spread into inflation in general. So it would be a hard measure, but all these studies have, of course, been done against the background of the security situation in Europe at the moment, which might make it necessary that we take hard measures, because somehow from a security policy perspective, we have to stop Putin escalating this war. We have, of course, to hinder Russia to win this war, and this can make it necessary that we take this kind of measures. The studies also emphasize that the preparation is needed. So gas is a storable energy carrier, so we can prepare for a possible stop of Russian gas by procuring gas on the world market worldwide, by substituting gas, for example, in the generation of electricity, substituted by coal, for example, in order to store more gas for the next winter, and by energy efficiency measures. There's a significant potential to consume less gas in all kinds of processes, in heating, in the industry, and so on. So this could also help getting to the next winter with more or less filled storage capacities. And I think one has to emphasize, and this would be maybe my last point for this first opening, I think one has to emphasize that the discussion is mixed. The discussion about the embargo, the delivery stop of Russian energy supplies, is mixed with a discussion on the long-term effects of diversifying the energy imports, which we need to do in order to become independent from Russia. But if we want to become independent from Russia, we have to procure gas on the world market, and this will be more expensive than the Russian gas was up to now. That is basically the reason why we have become so dependent on Russia, because that was the pipeline gas was the cheapest gas that we could procure. And so this long-term structural higher energy cost will be a big challenge for the German industry, of course. And I think this debate is mixed somehow. So this horrifying scenarios that come into place when the discussion goes about the energy embargo somehow is mixed with the insight that we have to face those higher energy costs now much faster, which will, of course, challenge the competitiveness of many of our energy-intensive industries. And this is something we have to deal with in the very near future, independently of whether energy supplies are stopped now immediately or after 1 or 2 years.
Okay, thank you, Veronika. So, Jacob, would you agree with that? I mean, is there a sense of, I guess, inevitability in that sense that prices will be high anyway because of energy transformation, but of course more acute if an embargo were to be implemented? But is the same picture true for all of Europe, Jacob, considering that there are countries in total that pay Russia nearly 800 million euros a day for oil, gas, and coal? What's the picture on a macro level?
Well, I mean, there's certainly countries across Europe that are even more dependent than Germany on Russian fossil fuel imports. You could take Austria, you could take the Baltic countries, arguably in some instances even Italy. But Germany, of course, is the biggest economy in the EU. So therefore, a marked slowdown or the kind of shallow recession that the studies that Veronika mentioned would, there would be significant spillover effects. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I guess I would agree with Veronika's overall, I mean, at least how I interpreted her sentiment, which is that from a macroeconomic point of view, this is an entirely manageable situation. None of the studies that I have certainly seen indicate anything other than a potential relatively shallow recession. that, yes, would complicate the short-term inflationary picture. It would make life harder for the ECB, and yes, it would require also, of course, a fiscal policy response. But frankly, this is something we know how to do. And it would also be the case that, of course, an outright recession would, maybe not in the immediate, but where it would probably be sort of stagflationary. You would have declining growth, but also higher prices led by energy. But certainly in the medium term, you would have, a recession is deflationary. So it would be one of those aspects that would bring down the overall price level. So in that sense, I would advocate a policy of doing more now. And I would advocate that, and by that I mean moving preferably immediately to having an embargo also on oil, certainly, and arguably even for gas. Because I think it's an important point that Veronika also made, is that this is a geopolitical accelerator process, if you like. It's basically forcing us to do things much more rapidly for geopolitical reasons that we would have done anyway. Or that we have committed ourselves to do anyway, I guess I should say, with, because we would not reach a 55% reduction in emissions in the EU by 2030 unless we basically had phased out much of this fossil fuel import from Russia and anywhere else by that time. So there is a speed factor here, but I think that in order to decide whether or not the acceleration is worth it or not, it's, I think, very important to recognize that, there is an argument that says, well, we don't need to do it because even if we do it, it's not going to stop the Russian war effort, next week anyway. And that is true. There is obviously uncertainty associated with that, but there's uncertainty associated also in the other end of that spectrum, so to speak, because as long as the war prevails, as long as the war continues, the outcome is highly uncertain and could very well be very costly to us. So I actually believe, because of this greatly heightened uncertainty from what is ultimately a major war on our doorstep, it is actually economically rational, in my opinion, in order to reduce that uncertainty, to do everything we can at the moment to cut the war as short as possible. And I certainly believe that an immediate impact, an immediate embargo on more aspects of Russian oil would do that, because they would greatly reduce the ability for Russia to, or they basically reduce Russian government revenues. They would still be able to print rubles, of course, to finance their war effort, but that would be potentially far more inflationary in Russia. So from that perspective, I don't consider it an emotional response to do more on the sanctions side. No, it is actually entirely economically rational to do so. And I think it's a pity that even this week, that the fifth round of sanctions does not therefore include at least also oil sanctions.
So Jacob, you actually sort of addressed my very next question that I was going to ask both of you, but I will ask it again for Veronika to weigh in. You mentioned some commentators think that an embargo wouldn't necessarily halt the war, but what would it do to the Russian economy? Economics Minister Robert Habeck seems to think a sudden import ban would harm the EU more than Russia. How do you see this cut across, Veronika? And of course, Jacob didn't mention gas. You just added the layer of oil. But if there were to be an embargo, what would it do for the war? Would that halt aggression right away? And how does it work against the Russian economy in comparison to the EU or Germany per se? Veronika, please.
Yeah, I think this is more a fog candle that this would hurt the EU more than Russia. It would hurt Russia a lot to impose that embargo. At the moment, since the start of the war, the EU has transferred 20 billion euros to Russia. And this is a huge sum, and it is used in order to stabilize the ruble. It is used for imports, and it has been also used to pay foreign soldiers, so from all over the world. I think if this money would not be available and the foreign exchange of the central bank, it is not usable due to the sanctions. So Russia could not import all the stuff. This is also stuff that is necessary for several supply chains, which would break down. Of course, Russia could print ruble to substitute in a certain way, but this would be inflationary, as Jacob just mentioned. So this would affect Russia a lot. It would also affect the European Union, but I think less so. Now, of course, it is not a 0-1 decision. One could start with an oil embargo, which would hurt Russia already quite hard because most of the income from energy exports is from income profits from oil exports. One could impose a tax, an import tax on the gas imports, and it is very likely that by doing so, we will reduce the payments to Russia by quite a bit. And also reduce the overall payment. So there are ways to start cutting down the payments to Russia without maybe hurting the European Union as much as if it would be the case for a whole delivery stop. Now, many people say, then they would stop deliveries immediately. That could be, maybe we have to take the risk. But on the other hand, we have seen that when Putin declared that we could only pay in ruble from last Friday on, he also stepped back from this when we refused. So this makes clear that he needs the income from the energy exports. It's not so clear whether a complete delivery stop would be the consequence if we, for example, start with an oil embargo.
And so you mentioned that there are other steps that the German government can take in short of a gas embargo. What about nuclear energy in Germany and also, Jacob, within Europe? Are there other solutions that could be leveraged in the short term till countries can isolate themselves in terms of energy policy from Russia? Jacob, why don't we, go ahead, Veronika, you start and then we'll go to Jacob.
So the role of nuclear energy, I think, in Germany is not so important. The gas use in the energy sector is minor as compared to the use of gas in industry and for heating. So that's between around 35% of the gas each is going to heating the private homes and industry processes and industry applications, usage of gas as an input factor and so on. So this is the big issue. And this, of course, cannot be substituted by nuclear energy. I would say also for the short term, we have coal power plants that have been sent into the reserve, which we can reactivate easily. So that would be the short-term measure to take. Substitute electricity production by gas power plants by electricity production with coal power plants. We could, I think, I would nevertheless reactivate or continue the 3 nuclear power plants that we still have running, just because in the next 2 to 5 years, we will also have scarcity of fossil energy carriers if we want to become more independent from Russia. So I think it would nevertheless be adequate to prolong them for, say, 5 years, if possible.
So Jacob, I think in Brussels, those adherents that see nuclear energy as a way towards a green economy have a stronger hand right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that in some member states, there is a, if you like, nuclear revival. Germany is clearly not one of them, but several of Germany's neighboring countries almost certainly will be. But I think it's, nuclear power, unless it comes in the form of, as Veronika says, not turning off existing plants in Germany, but you could make the same argument, which in fact has been done now. The Belgian government has announced that they're postponing the phase out. But obviously, construction of new nuclear power plants is not something that is relevant for, hopefully at least, for this war and then the response to it. So fundamentally, I mean, I agree with Veronika with that. In the short run, we have to substitute, either substitute or reduce demand. And then we can choose the substitution. We can basically begin, because Europe is rich, we could import basically pretty much all the LNG production in the world, basically be willing to pay the prices. They would be higher, certainly, than piped gas from Russia. But then we would also force the rest of the world to go to coal rather than LNG. So we might feel a little better here in Europe by doing that, but certainly the global emissions picture from doing that would mean significantly more coal-fired electricity generated at the global level. But then there are demand factors. There, we're certainly greatly helped by the season because a significant, or virtually all the seasonality in European gas demand comes from home heating. So there, in the short run, spring is helpful. But there are, of course, all other things we can do. I, for instance, am somewhat, mesmerized by the unwillingness of governments in Germany, but in basically all of the EU, to ask to have more concrete campaigns, asking for a consumer response, turning down the temperature, etc., in your home, doing it certainly by government decree in all public buildings, etc. We know that is quite effective, and I certainly believe that the response by the European publics to this, basically as a solidarity measure by, with the population in Ukraine, would be overwhelmingly well received. And I certainly believe that it should be tested. We haven't seen that yet. And then there is the question of, we know that there are specific industries and indeed specific plants in heavy chemicals, cement, etc., that are very, very heavy users of gas. And I guess if it comes to that, whether we should consider simply shutting these plants down for a temporary period, perhaps over the coming winter. We have just shut down the entire economy repeatedly because of COVID. And I certainly believe that, yes, there would be an economic cost and these industries would oppose it. But in the grand scheme of things, shutting down specific parts and specific industries might very well be, in my opinion, a cost-effective way of accelerating this, abandoning of Russian imports of fossil fuels and ultimately fossil fuels overall.
So Jacob, you have a talent for giving me a segue into my next question, because I mean, what you mentioned, and Veronika, I want to go to you on this. I feel like the German government is starting to move in that direction. I mean, it's activated this emergency plan, which would involve rationing in response to the crisis. And I think recently the Financial Times reported that if supplies fall short and attempts to lower consumption don't work, the government is going to cut off parts of the industry from gas or give preferential treatment to households. And Veronika, the government here has already, like Minister Habeck has started talking about, making sacrifices. And the government has introduced a relief package, right? Lowering gas prices at the tank and compensation for families and reduced transportation tickets. Is this the right course of action, or is this sort of maybe putting the German economy in a bubble of what's ahead? Because as you mentioned, energy transformation is coming and there will be disruption.
Yeah, that's true. I think part of the package of the relief package of the government is very plausible, and this is a part which helps the low and middle income class to get along with this situation. I mean, we had a very high inflation for quite some time now. The real income has decreased quite a bit, as basically never before, or at least not for a long time. So there were really losses of real income that have to be compensated for those who cannot sustain this situation. I think also to subsidize public transport is quite a good measure, because it will lead to substitution of driving private cars by public transport wherever possible. But I think it's very counterproductive to decrease the prices of fossil fuels and of gasoline, because this, of course, reduces the demand response to the high prices, which we really need at the moment, because if a delivery stop would become effective, of course, it is very important that gas and oil is already usage is already reduced. So this is quite counterproductive, and also it subsidizes people with very high income, which drive cars, which consume fossil fuels, and this is not plausible at all. And what has also been missing in this package is a clear signal that we are in a very particular situation, like a speed limit or car-free Sundays. One could have just sent a signal to the population. It's not compensating you for everything that comes over you, but it's also a signal that we are coming into a quite challenging time. And this has not been done, and I think this should be the case. By activating the emergency plan, in a way, this has happened, because people recognize that there is an emergency plan that has been activated. In effect, the first phase of this emergency plan is just a regime that increases information and coordination among relevant actors that would be relevant in case it came to a scarcity of energy supplies. So this emergency, this phase of the emergency plan is not really an emergent situation, but it's a first phase, and real hard measures would come with phase 2 and phase 3. I think that we would have to become much more effective in saving energy. All the energy efficiency measures could be promoted much more fiercely than it is done at the moment. So in principle, there should be an action plan which really tries to make use of all the potential that is there in the short run. And this is huge, but you have to activate it, because very often people don't see it in the prices. So very often people have flat rates or prices of their contracts raise only with some delay. So they will not experience the scarcity, because they do not see a real-time price. And that means that you have to inform them to save energy. And this is not done to the extent that it would be desirable. We don't hear you.
My apologies. I'm going to go to the questions from some of our listeners. And as Veronika mentioned, the scarcity is not being felt just yet. So in the meantime, Jacob, what alternative sources of energy can Europe perhaps pull together for the good of the Union? How can countries, this is Laurent is asking, how can countries in the Middle East help to alleviate the situation? Can Iran be enabled to export oil now, even though the JCPOA agreement is not yet renewed? And I know the US has obviously also had talks with Venezuela. there are not a lot of good choices out there, but what choices do we have besides Russia?
Well, I mean, none of them are good, I think is the short answer. We can cut deals with, as was mentioned in the chat, potentially Iran, but that obviously raises its own set of at least regional security political issues, because you could have a situation where if you cut a deal with Iran, well, then other large Middle Eastern producers in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia will potentially be less willing to increase their production. You can talk to Venezuela, but that, of course, has its own human rights and regional political implications. So in that sense, we are in the advantage in Europe that we are a rich part of the world, so we can afford. It won't be pleasant, but we can afford those higher prices. But we should be recognized that pretty much whatever choice we make on the fossil fuel side, we're going to impose, more carbon intensive, aka coal usage in the rest of the world. So in the short run, whatever we do is going to lead, as I said earlier, to more global emissions. Then we can, of course, continue, although it's not really effective in the immediate term. Obviously, the rollout of renewable energy in Europe, that means predominantly wind and solar, big pushes in a number of member states in that direction. That's very positive, but again, predominantly relevant in the medium term. And then again, coming back to demand. And I basically agree with everything that Veronika said about the inadequacy of the demand reduction measures, and of course, the counterproductive aspects of lowering fuel taxes. I would think it would be much better to make public transportation free for the next 3 months, for instance, because that will be a price signal that will be easily to communicate to the broader public, and they would immediately, I think, perceive and feel that there is a relative price signal that we should focus on here. It wouldn't reduce the need for many people to still use their car, but certainly you would have the price signal that was easy to convey, and therefore also a behavioral response by many consumers.
So Jacob, I'm going to stick with you for one more question from the chat, and this is more political, and Veronika, feel free to also comment. There's a question about Germany dragging its feet on imposing an embargo. What would it take for one to happen over the next month or so? It seems like Berlin is the only major holdout in the EU. Is that true, or are countries actually secretly happy that Germany is sort of playing the bad cop here? Because certainly there are other countries in the EU that are also skittish about an embargo.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's clearly a number of countries knowing full well that Germany has proven unwilling to move at the moment. They will sort of, politically risk-free say, like Italy, for instance, we will not oppose whatever the EU decides, implicitly hiding behind Berlin. So I think there's a fair amount of that. But what will it take to get Germany to move? Well, I think there are basically two things. One, there is, as I said, seasonality, particularly relevant on the gas side. So as it gets warmer, we need less gas right now. And then, of course, the longer you take until you have an embargo, for instance, on oil, the more time you have to find alternative sources, potentially reduce demand, etc. So there are, in that sense, the longer you wait, the more likely you are to ultimately move, provided that the political pressure that comes, unfortunately, mostly in the form of terrible footage, proof of Russian war crimes in Ukraine, which raises the, I think it's fair to say, across the EU, but certainly also domestically in Germany, the demand for more actions to be done right now. So I think we have now the announcement from the Commissioner President von der Leyen that we should embargo coal. Well, that can only be a first step. I think embargoes against oil will come, and they will come a lot sooner than the end of the year, simply because this constant accumulation of political pressure and Russian atrocities will not be a political place where the German government and with it the rest of the EU can sustain itself for very long.
Veronika, I think you should come in here too. I mean, we've seen a lot of taboos here in Germany fall to the wayside over the last month, but energy, as I said, seems to be the sticking point. Do you think, as Jacob mentioned, that there will be political pressure for Berlin, and maybe there will be a change of heart in Berlin about an embargo?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned one aspect that's very crucial. It's a very emotional debate. I think there is pressure already in Germany, but it is only or mostly the emotional side is discussed, less the middle to long run strategic aspects of an embargo. And of course, from a strategic perspective, it is better to go fast and hard in order to stop the war faster. You will not stop it immediately. That's one other fog candle that's always there, that people say, if you would know that it stopped the war immediately, then we would do it immediately. But that's, of course, not an argument. Of course, it does not stop the war immediately, but the sooner you do it, the earlier you cut off the income of the Russian state. And the faster, of course, it affects also the situation of Russia in this war. So that there is this lack of strategic thinking or strategic thinking in the debate. The debate is very much focused on the short-run economic cost, and this is emphasized very much also by politicians who focus very much on unemployment consequences and people getting cut off, or industry getting cut off the gas supply. And this is, of course, very much a focus on the short-run cost, but less the focus on the medium and long-term benefits of having an embargo. What is also lacking from my point of view is the European coordination. I think we should coordinate much better in gas procurement, and we should, I don't know whether it happens, but it could help. We should, of course, coordinate on how we can share the cost, because it's not only, it may be less relevant even for Germany, but more relevant for Italy. I think there will be some cost, because we would also need fiscal policy response. If there would be an embargo, there would have to be measures that help industry, that impede unemployment by short-term work and so on. And this is, of course, a fiscal burden to the states that are particularly hardly hit by an embargo. And I think the European Union should also discuss whether and how it could share this cost, because it makes it easier for the states that are heavily affected to join into an embargo. So this is not really discussed, at least not openly, but I think it would be very important.
So I'm going to split up two questions, one for each of you that's in the Q&A box. There had been talk about establishing an escrow account, Victoria, as a way to, sort of have the stick and carrot with Russia, but also perhaps using proceeds to help rebuild Ukraine in the post-conflict period. Has there, do you think, been a serious attempt at that on the part of Germany and its EU partners? And then, Jacob, I'd like you to discuss, if there is an embargo, couldn't Russia sort of sell its fossil fuels to other takers in Asia, for example, who may also want to try to reduce coal and look to oil from Russia instead? But why don't we go to you first, Veronika, about the question of an escrow account?
The escrow accounts have been discussed, but I think there's a big fear that this would lead to an immediate embargo or immediate delivery stop. So that's basically why it has not been followed up on. Maybe can I comment quickly on the issue of sales of the Russian energy carriers to Asia, for example. I think this is basically what makes a medium-run independence strategically a quite different thing from immediate embargo. Because in the medium run, of course, it hurts us a lot because it increases our energy cost. But Russia can sell, of course, in the medium run, its gas and oil also to Asia. They are already working at a pipeline or planning a pipeline that connects the Yamal fields with Asia. And so this discussion is, of course, a discussion that is misleading. In the medium run, this will not affect the war at all, and it's not that much of a threat to Russia, but it's more motivating Russia and China to get faster. This is something that we should have a close look into. Both Russia and China will observe very closely how we react to the current situation. And of course, armed conflicts will be much more likely if Russia and China observe that we react quite timidly. Of course, this will motivate both to use armed conflicts in order to reach their long-run goals. And this is a very dangerous situation, which should be kept in mind.
Jacob, what do you think? I mean, the West has been quite united in having a hard stance against Russia, but there are other parts of the world that have a different view when it comes to relations with Russia. How does that work in the energy equation?
Well, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think I agree with what Veronika said about the escrow account. The biggest outstanding question with regards to potential funds for Ukrainian reconstruction is whether we at some point actually decide rather than freeze the 300 billion in Russian foreign exchange reserves, but actually seizes that money and transfers it to Russia to Ukrainian reconstruction. And then in response to Megan's question on the chat, I actually disagree with that, because I think that the reason that you are going to see a significant increase in coal use in Asia, irrespective of whether or not they can buy oil cheaper from Russia at a discount, is that it is the issue of electricity production. Most of these countries run either coal or gas-fired electricity power plants. And if LNG becomes too expensive because Europe buys it all, well, then they're going to be forced to buy coal, and they won't actually have the ability to use oil to produce electricity. That is why coal use will go up. But I think on the broader issue of Western unanimous sanctions, look, we need to be honest. The big issue here is China. What is the interpretation in Beijing of what has happened to Russia from armed aggression against its neighbor when it thinks about the strategic outlook it wants vis-a-vis Taiwan? And there, I think China sees that all the major reserve currencies of the world have now banded together to freeze Russian foreign exchange reserves. If you're China and you have $3 trillion in those currencies, that's obviously a bigger issue. I think China sees that all the major advanced economies, all of the G7, plus South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all the major producers of chips around the world, technology, have technologically sanctioned Russia. That would certainly also, in my opinion, be the case for China if it were to choose to invade Taiwan. So far, so good. But on the other hand, they will look at Europe's response, including those countries with large economic exposure to the Chinese market, aka Germany, for instance, and see that we are clearly not willing to bear a significant economic cost of energy sanctions today, and therefore they might be encouraged to be a little crude, to say that the German government and German industry would prefer to continue to sell BMWs in the Chinese market rather than bear the cost of a full economic embargo in case of aggression against Taiwan. But the bottom line is there is a very important strategic signal being sent by Europe and the entire G7 in its response to the Russian aggression.
So we're out of time, and I feel like we could have a whole nother session on what you just said, Jacob and Veronika, about China and looking at the long game in terms of energy dependencies and trade dependencies. But maybe one quick question for both of you. It could be a yes or no answer. With this crisis, does this mean that the EU new Green Deal, will we reach the goals quicker than 2030? I mean, is this going to be an impetus for change before 2030? Or is that too hard to map out now?
Yeah, I think some goals will be reached earlier. For example, the expansion of the renewables and the import of hydrogen and green hydrogen-based synthetic energy carriers. I think this will be speeded up significantly, but some other goals will not be reached in the way they have planned. For example, the transformation of the industry in Germany builds very much on gas as a bridge technology, cheap gas as a bridge technology, and this will be challenged quite a lot. And I think it has to be rethought, and this structural change that we would have experienced maybe much later in this decade, this will come much earlier. So we will have to take very hard decisions very early on when it comes to industry and structural change there.
You gave a confident yes, Jacob.
Yeah, no, I mean, for exactly the reason that Veronika said, namely that this is a massive accelerator. We're going to see much more rapid build out of renewable resources in both wind and solar, simply because governments now has a geopolitical incentive to, if you like, overcome NIMBYism and local opposition to offshore wind parks, etc. So we're going to get that. But that also, on the other hand, we have the problem of the transition technology, energy sources that are not available, as Veronika says. So we're going to have to leapfrog rather than sort of immaculately transition. We're going to have to leapfrog to hydrogen, green hydrogen, much faster than we otherwise would have. And that exactly, I mean, I agree completely with what Veronika said. It will force some tough decisions to be taken in Germany and other member states.
Well, thanks to both of you. It was a fascinating discussion, very, very informative, and we hope to have you back together again, perhaps in this constellation. And to all of you that have tuned in, thanks for taking part, and we look forward to seeing you next month, where we will also discuss the Zeitenwende, but this time the military dimension. Thanks to everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.